There are two things that people think of when they see me. One, why hasn't that boy got a haircut recently? Two, man, that hair looks amazing. And I know right now, you're thinking the second. Imagine the last time you had your haircut. What was the worst thing you heard? The most dangerous thing I ever heard a barber said was, "Oh my." And it sounds funny until you realize that in some places, language itself is treated as misbehavior. Last summer, while I was at Nationals, an online report from ABC7 on your side in Arkansas reported a beauty college was facing backlash for forcing students to sign documents saying that they agree not to speak Spanish on campus. The punishment for failure to sign? Possible suspension or even expulsion. Oh my. I spent so much of the drive home from Boise thinking about this incident and what it means for the people that I love. When a society decides which languages are acceptable, it decides which people are. You might be asking yourself why this is something that matters to me. My last name isn't Hispanic. I don't speak Spanish, but the truth is that I'm a fourth Mexican. My father is half, and my grandparents are 100% Hispanic, and they even speak the language as their first language. And I decided to ask them about it when we went to go visit them when we got home in June. My grandma actually talked about how her own elementary and middle schools had similar policies. The policy at Arkansas Beauty College in Russellville is just a small example of language stifling initiatives that existed across history. When institutions regulate language, they're deciding whose identity is allowed to take up space. Research published in the Oxford Journal of Applied Linguistics in April 2025 examines how English-only discourse and monolingual policies can discursively shape people as abnormal or outside the group in English-dominant societies. In this article, it proves that Australian speakers who use languages other than English are positioned as inferior. Language is more than just words, and it is the mechanism that people use to understand themselves and their place in the world. And when institutions have policies that restrict that language, they erase culture, identity, and the ability for people to connect. We're going to look at this complex issue in two different points. First, we will look at how language impacts every human. Second, we will look at historical examples where these policies were put in place. My first point. Writing in the Scientific American, Lara Boroditsky explains that language shapes the most fundamental dimensions of human experience, meaning that language doesn't just express thought, it trains it. The research shows that language trains the brain. Most people assume that the brain is akin to hardware and language is a program that's run on top of it. In essence, that underlying structure of human understanding is the same, regardless of the language that it is used. In reality, language guides the formation of the way our brain orients each person in the world. When a language repeatedly requires a speaker to pay attention to certain details, people organize the world in the same way. Boroditsky demonstrates this through her works with speakers of Cook Thayor, an Aboriginal language spoken in Pormpuraaw, Australia. In Cook Thayor, people use cardinal directions like north, south, east, and west in everyday conversation. In turn, they develop this innate sense and awareness of direction. They can complete spatial tasks more easily and accurately because their language has trained their minds to think that way. And it's not just an impact on space, it also changes how people think about time. English speakers tend to organize time from left to right, matching the way English is written and read. Cook Thayor speakers, however, organize time based on a physical direction, such as east to west, regardless of which way they are facing. This shows that language provides a mental structure for understanding abstract ideas like time, and not just different sounds used to describe the same thing. The same pattern appears in memory. Research comparing English, Spanish, and Japanese speakers shows that English speakers are more likely to remember who caused an event, and even when it was an accident. Spanish and Japanese speakers, whose languages are often describe accidents without actually naming a person, are less likely to remember the agent. The difference is what each language trains speakers to notice and store. All across all of these examples, a simple but important process emerges. Language directs attention. Repeated attention becomes thinking habits, and those habits shape how people experience and remember the world. That is why taking away or replacing someone's language will not just change how they speak, but how they naturally think and understand for themselves. Writing for UNESCO in June 2025, Dr. Katie Alvarez explains that when a language disappears, it takes with it generations of ancestral knowledge, cultural practices, and unique ways of understanding the world that cannot be replaced or translated. Put simply, when a language disappears, the knowledge tied to it disappears as well, because the knowledge lives inside the language itself. This is illustrated specifically in ethnobotanical knowledge. Indigenous languages such as Waorni, Shuar, and Quechua contain precise words for plants at different stages of growth, preparation, and use. These words carry practical knowledge about farming, medicine, and survival, and when the language fades, that knowledge simply cannot be translated. Treatments like quinine, a key remedy for malaria, were discovered only because indigenous languages preserved detailed understanding of medicinal plants. Language loss also disrupts intergenerational communication. Alvarez observes that many indigenous children no longer speak the languages that their parents or their grandparents speak, making it difficult to pass down cultural norms, ethical values, and community decision-making practices. This is not just about losing words, but about how communities teach responsibility, resolve conflict, and govern themselves. Together, these examples show that language acts as a container for knowledge systems. When a language disappears, much of what is carried is lost entirely and not replaced. Writing in the Iruling Journal of English Education and Linguistics in October 2024, researchers conclude that language preserves culture itself, and when a language disappears, societies lose the shared identity that it carried. Language is a means of conserving and perpetuating culture. Societies lose their cultural identity when a language is lost. The research here demonstrates that language functions as a storage system for cultural memory. Throughout history, political power and government institutions have often shaped which languages are encouraged, restricted, or even replaced. A well-documented example of this process can be seen in the decline of the Gaelic language in Scotland. Gaelic was widely spoken beginning around the 5th century, but its use began to decline as English became the language of government, trade, and law. In 1609, the Statutes of Iona required Highland chiefs to educate their children in English and adopt English customs. Over time, this institutional pressure made English necessary for social mobility and economic participation. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, children were punished in schools for speaking Gaelic, reinforcing the idea that their language did not belong in formal spaces. We can see that similar patterns can be observed in more recent history within the United States. During the mid-20th century, many schools in states such as Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California implemented English-only policies that restricted the use of Spanish in educational settings. In Robstown, Texas, during the 50s and 60s, students reported receiving detention, loss of privileges, and even were labeled as disciplinary problems for speaking Spanish at school. In Socorro County, New Mexico, students who spoke Spanish reported punishments such as paddling, kneeling on books for extended periods of times, or holding heavy books at arm's length. These practices show that language regulation in schools is often used as a form of behavioral control rather than a tool for learning. Language regulation has also appeared through the form of policy rather than direct punishment. California Proposition 227, passed in 1998, ended bilingual education in public schools. Arizona Proposition 203, passed in 2000, similar requirements. While these policies differed from early disciplinary practices, they still reduced institutional support for bilingual education. Across these historical and modern examples, a consistent pattern emerges. When institutions regulate language, they influence which languages are maintained, which ones declined, and how cultural knowledge is transmitted across generations. Take a moment and consider how you would respond if you were told that you could no longer speak the language you have spoken for your entire life. For most of us, that language is where our memories live. It's how we learned, how we formed relationships, how we made sense of the world around us. Losing it would not simply be an inconvenience, it would be disorienting. And when I spoke to my grandmother after returning home, she described it as something what it felt like to grow up in a school system where her language was treated as something that didn't belong. Her experience isn't a unique one. It reflects the reality that's faced by millions of people whose first language is discouraged, restricted, or even replaced, not because it lacked value, but because it didn't align with institutional expectations.